It was late June 2013 when I decided to take a few days off and go camping alone in the Peak District. I was 27 back then, working a dull office job in Birmingham. I'd been saving my annual leave and finally got a week off after a brutal quarter. My plan was to just get away from screens, people, and concrete. I wanted air, trees, and stillness. I needed to feel small under the sky again. I wasn't new to solo camping. I had done it 4 or 5 times before, always in quieter, lesser-known spots. I'd usually take a small tent, a sleeping mat, and some food. I never made fires. I preferred to pack light, stay hidden, and sleep early. I liked the silence of it, the mental reset it gave me. I picked a place I had never camped before, a stretch of forest west of Buxton, not one of the touristy walking routes. I found it by scrolling on Google Maps and then cross-checking the area on a few hiking forums. It didn't seem like many people went deep into that stretch, which was what I wanted. Secluded, undisturbed. I drove up in my old Vauxhall Astra, parked it a couple of miles outside a tiny village called Kelmorton, and hiked in from there with everything I needed packed into one large rucksack. It was mid-morning when I started the walk. The path was uneven, narrow, and overgrown in some places, but I liked that. The trees weren't thick at first, but as I moved deeper, they began crowding closer together. Birch and pine, mostly. The smell of wet earth and moss started to hang heavier around me. I walked for about 2 hours before I found a good spot. Flat ground, a natural clearing, no dead branches above, soft moss underfoot. I could just barely hear a stream nearby, but otherwise, it was dead quiet. No road noise, no planes, no people. I set up my tent, unpacked, and boiled some water for tea. After drinking it, I just lay back on my mat outside the tent and stared up at the patch of sky above. That first day was peaceful. I walked a little, read a bit, and turned in early. Around 8:30, it was already getting dim under the tree canopy. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, not bothering to use earplugs because there wasn't a single sound, not even birdsong after dark. That kind of silence can be beautiful, but also strange when you realize how total it is. I must have fallen asleep easily. I remember waking up once in the night, maybe around 1 a.m., just needing to pee. I got out, took a few steps away from the tent, and did my business. No flashlight, just a faint moon glow bleeding through the trees. The air was cool, and the forest smelled damp and old, but I didn't feel afraid. I went back in and slept through till morning. The second day started fine. I made porridge, walked around the forest, and filled my bottles at the stream using a filter. Around mid-afternoon, though, I started feeling off. I can't really describe it clearly. It wasn't fear. It was more like a heaviness, like something had shifted slightly and my brain was just catching up. I stopped enjoying the quiet. I started listening for something. That night, I ate early and lay in my sleeping bag with a book. The forest was still quiet, too quiet. I hadn't seen a single other person in over 30 hours. Not even a hiker passing by. That was what I'd wanted, but now it felt unnatural. Like something was keeping people away. Around 10 p.m., I turned off my headlamp and closed my eyes. I wasn't sleeping yet. I was just lying there, listening. I didn't hear anything for a long time, but at some point, I don't know when exactly, I thought I heard footsteps. Not close, not loud, but not an animal either. Too rhythmic, too slow, like someone walking carefully. I held my breath. The sound was so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But it had a pattern. Step, pause, then silence. I didn't move. I just lay there for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because I woke up in the morning with sunlight coming through the thin nylon. I got out and looked around. Nothing disturbed. No broken twigs. No prints. I told myself it had probably been a deer, maybe a badger, maybe my own breathing tricked me. but the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with me as I boiled water and ate breakfast. It stayed with me as I walked to the stream. I looked over my shoulder more than once that morning. I never saw anyone, but the feeling grew. That afternoon, I thought about packing up and leaving. Not because anything had happened, nothing concrete anyway, but I just felt watched. And not in a paranoid, irrational way. I'm not that kind of person. It was like my senses were picking up something my mind couldn't place. But I stayed. I told myself I was being dramatic, that I wanted solitude, and this is what it felt like. That night, I didn't sleep well. I woke up again around midnight. I had no idea what woke me, but I remember blinking in the dark and feeling alert. I stayed still, listening. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time they were closer. Step, pause, step, crunch. Leaves, twigs. Someone was moving near the tent. Slowly, not speaking, not shining a light, just moving. I held my breath. The sound circled around the tent once. Not a full circle, more like a semicircle. Then nothing. I didn't move all night. I just lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, ears straining. I didn't sleep again until the sun rose. That morning, I got up as soon as it was light enough to see. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, scanning the area. I walked the perimeter. Nothing. But then I saw something I hadn't seen before. On a tree, about 20 feet away. A mark. A vertical scratch on the bark. Fresh. Long, deep, like it had been done with something sharp. A knife, maybe. I stood there for a while, just looking at it, trying to decide what it meant. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. By 8 a.m., I'd made my decision. I packed up everything. Tent, mat, food, gear. I was out of there by 9. My plan was to hike back to the car, head to a motel, and just take the rest of my leave somewhere indoors. I didn't want to be out here anymore. The forest had changed, or I had. The hike back felt longer than I remembered. The path seemed different in parts. The trees felt tighter. I kept stopping and listening. I didn't hear anything at first, but about halfway through, I thought I heard movement again. Behind me, when I stopped, it stopped. When I walked, it picked up again. Not constantly, just in bursts. I never saw anyone, but I know someone was there. I started walking faster, then faster again. I didn't run, but I was close. My heart was thudding. My rucksack felt twice as heavy. I was sweating even though the air was cool. When I finally saw the edge of the trees and the open land beyond, I nearly cried. My car was still there, right where I'd left it on the gravel levee. Nothing touched, nothing stolen. I threw my bag in the back, got in, and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached a petrol station near Matlock. I sat there in the car for 20 minutes, just letting my breathing return to normal. I stayed at a Travelodge that night. Cheap, clean, bright lights. I barely slept again, but at least there were walls and locks. The next morning, I drove home to Birmingham. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not because I thought they'd laugh, but because I didn't even know how to explain it. A week passed, then 2. I started sleeping normally again. The fear faded into memory, like most fear does. But then, one night, I was going through the photos on my phone, mostly landscape shots from that trip. Trees, mossy rocks, my tent by the stream. I was about to delete a few to clear space when I noticed something in one of them. It was a picture I'd taken on the second day, just after breakfast. I'd propped the phone on a stump and set a timer. Just me standing next to the tent. But in the background, deep in the trees, there was something, or someone, a figure, barely visible, standing between 2 trunks. Still, dark, watching. I zoomed in, my hands sweating. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't a branch. It was a man. No detail, just a silhouette. standing there, looking in my direction, not moving. I don't know how long he was there. I don't know if he followed me the whole time or if I just stumbled into somewhere I shouldn't have. I deleted the photo. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want it on my phone. Maybe because I knew what it meant. I never went camping alone again after that. I still go hiking sometimes, with friends, in well-known areas. But that trip stayed with me, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. Because someone was out there, watching me, moving through the woods at night, and I never knew why, and I never will. I was 36 when I took that trip out to northern Montana. I had just gone through a messy breakup that left me drained in a way I didn't even recognize at the time. I'd moved out of the house I had rented with her, taken a leave from work, and packed my old Tacoma with camping gear I hadn't used in years. My plan was simple: find a remote patch of land, away from towns and roads and people, and just camp. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to look at my phone. I didn't want to answer questions or explain myself. I had driven almost 1,000 miles from New Mexico, taking my time and sleeping in rest stops and motels along the way. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. No one really asked. I just told my boss I needed time, and he said to take it. I settled on an area about 25 miles south of the Canadian border. It was July 2023, and the weather had been warm but not stifling. I picked a spot about 2 miles off a dirt road that cut through national forest land. There was no cell signal for miles. No one else was around. I liked that. What made me choose that particular spot was the view. From the edge of the tree line where I parked my truck, I could see low hills stretching out in every direction. Tall grass swayed like water. Off to the west, there was a broken line of trees and a ridge behind them, and below that, what looked like a dried-out railway line. I remember noticing that on the map. The old tracks hadn't been used in decades. Some freight route that shut down in the 70s, I think. I thought nothing of it at the time, just a detail on a map. I set up camp just inside the trees, maybe 100 yards from where the forest ended and the field opened up. I cleared a spot for my small tent, dug a fire pit, and made a basic shelter with tarps in case it rained. I spent the rest of that first afternoon hiking the area. There were no real trails, so I just wandered, occasionally checking the map I printed out from the Forest Service website. By the time the sun dipped low behind the ridge, the air had cooled and I started a small fire. I heated a can of chili and watched the sky turn pink and purple. It was quiet, real quiet. That deep kind of silence you only get far away from towns. The kind where even your breathing seems louder. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next day passed without anything worth noting. I woke early, brewed coffee over the fire, then hiked up the slope toward the ridge. From the top, I could see for miles. Somewhere way off to the southeast, I spotted a tower, maybe a ranger station or some radio antenna. Otherwise, there was nothing. No fences, no campsites, no people. I walked down to the railway line that afternoon. The tracks were rusty and half buried in grass and weeds. In some places, the metal rails had been pried up or bent from frost heave. There were old wooden ties rotting away under the brush. The path itself was wide and flat enough to walk comfortably on, so I followed it west for about half a mile until I came to an old rail bridge that spanned a shallow, dried-up creek. The bridge looked unstable, with twisted metal beams and missing planks, so I turned around and headed back. That night, things started to feel different. I didn't notice it at first. It was more like a subtle shift, something in the air, or maybe in me. Around sunset, I was sitting by the fire when I heard a sharp sound off in the distance. It came from the direction of the railway. At first, I thought it might be an animal, coyote or something, but it didn't sound right. It was short and metallic, not a howl or growl, more like a clang. I stood up and listened. The forest around me was still. The fire popped. I waited a long minute. Nothing followed. I figured it was probably just an old rail tie falling apart or maybe a deer knocking something loose. I tried not to think much of it, but the sound stayed with me. Something about it seemed deliberate. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. The tent was quiet, no wind, no rain, but I had this cold feeling in my stomach like I was being watched. I sat up, listened. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I got out, grabbed my flashlight, and did a slow circle around the tent and fire pit. Everything looked normal. No tracks, no animals. Still, I didn't sleep well after that. The next day was cloudy. I spent most of the morning writing in my journal and reading. By afternoon, the air felt heavy. I walked the rail line again, this time heading east. The path curved gently and dropped slightly into a hollow, where it disappeared into thicker brush. I didn't go far, maybe another mile, before turning back. I kept having that strange feeling again, like I was being watched. Not by an animal, though. This was different. My instincts weren't screaming danger exactly, more like unease. Back at camp, I found something odd. There were boot prints near my fire pit. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They weren't mine. I checked against the tread of my own boots, different pattern. They were slightly wider, and the sole had a square grid pattern I didn't recognize. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe made that morning. There were about 6 or 7 prints total, all leading in a rough arc around the fire and then off toward the trees. I hadn't seen anyone. Not once. Not since I got there. That night, I didn't start a fire. I cooked over my camp stove instead and kept the light low. I didn't sleep much. Every little sound made me sit up. At one point, I heard rustling from the direction of the field. Then nothing. Just silence. The next morning, I hiked back out toward my truck and drove 5 miles south to where I knew there was a ranger station. I found a posted sign, but no one around. The building looked unused. I left a note, just in case, saying I was camped north and had seen fresh boot tracks. I considered packing up and leaving, but a part of me didn't want to give in to the fear. I had come out here to be alone, to reset. I didn't want to run at the first sign of something weird, so I stayed. But I kept my knife on me from then on, and my hatchet. I also tied a piece of fishing line low between 2 trees behind my tent, just to give me some warning if someone walked through at night. That evening, I sat quietly in the trees and watched the edge of the field. It was around 7 p.m. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the grass. I saw movement near the ridge. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I stared, I realized it was a person, a man. He was crouched near the broken line of trees, half hidden behind a dead trunk. I could barely make him out, but I saw enough. He was just sitting there, staring in my direction. He didn't move, not for a long time. Eventually, I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my tent with my flashlight off, holding my knife, straining to hear every little sound. Around midnight, I heard the faintest snap of a branch, then another. The fishing line I'd strung behind the tent suddenly jerked. I heard it twang against the bark. Something had hit it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. Then footsteps, soft, careful. They circled my tent. I waited until I couldn't hear anything. Then I crawled out slowly, holding my flashlight and blade. I swept the beam around. Nothing, but the boot prints were back. This time only a few, but they were close. Closer than before. To first light, I packed everything. I didn't care about food or waste. I stuffed my gear in the truck and left the area without looking back. But I didn't go far. I parked about 10 miles south, behind a set of hills. where I knew the tree cover was thicker. I camped one more night, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. I needed to feel like I wasn't being chased out of the wilderness by some stranger. That night was quiet. I left the next morning, drove all the way to Idaho in one long day. A few weeks later, I looked up old news articles about that part of Montana. I found something buried in the archives from 1986, a short piece about a man found dead near the old railway line. No ID, no car. They thought he might have been a drifter or someone hiding out. There were rumors about old military training sites in the area, abandoned bunkers, or hermits who lived off the grid. None of it meant much, just stories. But I still think about that man in the trees, about how quiet he was, how patient. I never saw his face, never heard his voice. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe just to scare me. Or maybe he lived out there, waiting for someone to come close enough. I never went camping alone again after that. Not because I'm scared of the woods. I'm scared of the people who choose to live where no one can see them. People who never want to be found. And the ones who don't want you to leave once you've seen them. It was in the summer of 2016 when I took the trip. I was 28 at the time, living alone in Leeds, England. My job was boring. I worked remote doing insurance claims from home, staring at a screen for 8 hours a day. That year, I needed a real break from noise, people, screens. Everything. I didn't want to go abroad. I just wanted to disappear into the countryside, off-grid, for a few days. So I did what I always do when I get overwhelmed. I packed my camping gear into my old Peugeot and started driving north, toward Northumberland. I didn't have a plan or even a destination. I just drove. I had a few places marked on my map, but I wanted somewhere quiet, alone, private. Somewhere I could light a fire, sit by myself and just think. I wasn't scared of being alone. I liked it that way. After several hours, I passed through a small village that didn't even have a proper sign. Just a few houses and a pub that looked permanently closed. I was driving along narrow roads with dry stone walls on either side, sheep grazing nearby, hills in the distance. That's when I saw it. A narrow dirt track cut off the road to the left. The hedges had nearly swallowed it up. No sign, no gate, no warnings. Just this rough lane going down into a dip behind the trees. I slowed down and checked my phone. No service. Perfect. I turned onto the track. My tires crunched over old gravel and ruts. The road was tight, winding through old trees. I drove slowly, pushing branches out of the way, until it finally opened into a wide, empty field. That's when I saw the farm. It was clearly abandoned. The roof sagged in places, some of the tiles had fallen off. The barn beside it was missing planks and had ivy growing up the side. A half-collapsed drywall ran along the back of the field. There were no animals. No sounds. Just wind in the trees and the ticking of my engine. It was perfect, quiet, hidden, private. I parked the car by the edge of the field, next to a rusted old trailer that hadn't moved in years. I left the car locked, pulled my gear out, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, firewood, folding chair, the usual stuff, and walked a little further into the field. I picked a spot near a few scattered trees where the grass was short and level, and started setting up camp. The air smelled of dry grass and old wood. It was warm, but the breeze kept it from feeling stuffy. There were flies buzzing around, and I saw a few rabbits darting into hedgerows at the far edge. That was the only sign of life. Once the tent was up and the fire pit dug, I sat back and just watched the place. The farmhouse didn't scare me. I'd seen worse. It looked like nobody had been there in years. The windows were broken. The back door hung open at an angle. Ivy climbed halfway up the outer wall. I could see old farm equipment rusting behind the barn. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I wasn't curious. I was there to be alone, not explore some rotting house. That first night was peaceful. I made a small fire, cooked some sausages, drank a beer, and just sat back watching the sky turn orange and then dark. There wasn't a single light for miles. I saw stars I hadn't seen in years. It was silent. I mean, properly silent. No cars, no neighbors, no hum of electronics. Just wind and a few distant owls. When I finally got into my tent, I slept harder than I had in months. The second day started normally. I woke up late, stretched out under the sun, boiled some water for coffee, and walked around the field barefoot. I thought about my life, my job. I thought about quitting, moving north, living quiet like this forever. I wandered around the edge of the property, past the trees and hedgerows, and tried to figure out who owned this place. The land looked like it had been untouched for years. There were no recent tire tracks, no fences that looked new. I did find a wooden post with old barbed wire, but it was rusted and bent. That afternoon, I sat in my chair, reading a book, when I noticed something strange. The back door of the farmhouse, the one hanging open, looked like it had moved. Earlier it was wide open, almost falling off. Now it was just barely cracked. I stared at it for a while, but the wind was strong, and I figured it had probably just blown shut a bit. Still, I moved my chair around to face the house instead of turning my back to it, just in case. That night was different. I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up to sounds. Nothing clear, but little creaks, snaps, maybe footsteps in the grass. But every time I unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing. Just wind and trees and shadows. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a fox, maybe a badger nosing around the camp. I went back to sleep, but not for long. Around 3 a.m., I woke again. This time, I was sure I heard something walking through the grass. Not heavy footsteps, but slow, steady ones. I held my breath. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. It stopped outside the tent. I heard the soft crunch of grass, then silence. I stayed still for at least 10 minutes, heart hammering in my chest. Eventually, I unzipped the tent and peeked out. There was no one there, but my firewood pile had been knocked over. The next morning, I walked the whole field. I looked for footprints, signs of animals, anything. The grass was trampled in spots, but it was hard to tell what caused it. Could have been me or a rabbit or something else. I thought about packing up, leaving, but I was stubborn. I told myself I was being paranoid. I stayed. I avoided the farmhouse still, but I did walk past it once, just to look. Up close, it smelled like old rot and mold. The windows were so dirty I couldn't see inside. The back door had shut again, this time all the way. I didn't touch it. I just walked past, pretending I didn't care. That evening, the feeling of being watched got stronger. I couldn't explain it. I just felt it. Every time I turned around, I expected to see someone at the edge of the trees, but there was nothing. I built another fire, ate my food quickly, and sat with my back to the car, facing everything else. I didn't even drink that night. I wanted to stay clear-headed. Around 10 p.m., I saw something. A shadow moved behind the barn. I couldn't tell what it was. Too fast to be a person, but too big to be a rabbit or fox. I stood up, staring hard at the edge of the barn. Nothing came out. No sounds. Just stillness. I left the fire burning low and went into the tent early, locking my car doors before I went. I didn't sleep much. Around 1 a.m., I heard something again. This time it was clear. Footsteps. Not one, but two. Then silence. Then a sound like breathing. Close. Just outside the tent. I didn't move. I didn't look. Eventually, it faded. Slowly. Like someone walking away into the grass. When I woke at dawn, something was wrong. My car boot was open. Not just open, ripped open. The lock was broken. My backpack had been thrown out. My food was scattered. But nothing was taken. Nothing valuable was missing. My phone was still in the tent. My wallet was still inside my bag. It felt like someone had been looking for something. Not stealing, searching. That was it. I was done. I packed my gear in record time, skipped breakfast, and got everything back into the car. I wasn't even scared anymore. I was angry. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't gonna sit around for more. I took one last look at the farmhouse before I got into the car. The back door was wide open again. But this time, I saw something inside, just for a second. A figure. It ducked away as soon as I saw it. I got in the car, started the engine, and pulled out fast. I didn't stop until I hit proper road again, and even then I didn't check my phone until I reached a petrol station an hour later. When I got service, I did something I hadn't thought of before. I searched the area, the farm, the land. Turns out the farm had been abandoned since 1998, when the owner, a man named Malcolm Bryson, disappeared. He was in his late 60s, lived alone, no family. His body was never found. There were stories, of course. Neighbors said he was odd, reclusive, paranoid. Some said he was growing things he shouldn't. Others said he'd been hiding something under the floorboards. No one knew the full story. The land went into probate, but no one claimed it. It just sat there, empty. But here's the thing that stuck with me. One of the articles I read mentioned that before he vanished, Malcolm had filed a report with police. Said someone was living in his barn without permission. Said they only came out at night. Said he heard them breathing through the walls. Police dismissed it as dementia. Reading that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I don't know who or what I saw out there, but I do know someone was still there, still hiding, still watching. I never went back. I never camped alone again. Sometimes I still dream of that field, of the broken door, of the sound of footsteps outside my tent. And sometimes, when it's quiet enough, I still think I hear breathing that isn't mine. My name is Mark Hensley. I'm 34 now, but this happened back in 2017 when I was 26. At the time, I was living in Leeds, England, working as a freelance web designer. I didn't have a steady schedule, which meant I could sometimes vanish for a few days at a time without anyone wondering where I'd gone. That's exactly what I did on the first week of October that year. I took a solo trip up to the Scottish Highlands, something I'd always wanted to do. I needed a break from work and city noise, and I wanted complete quiet for a while. I didn't book a lodge or B/NB. I packed my old tent, my camping stove, a few supplies, and drove up in my 2004 Land Rover Discovery. I didn't tell many people where I was going. Just shot a text to a mate, Josh, saying I'd be off-grid for a bit. No signal, nothing serious. That was it. I had this plan to camp in a spot I'd read about on some backpacking forum a few months earlier. The place didn't have a name, not one on the map anyway. It was near a loch, hidden between hills, not far from the Cairngorms National Park, but well off the main walking paths. Apparently, few people ever camped there because it was tricky to find and didn't have much flat land. But I liked that idea, being alone. I liked the idea of being somewhere quiet enough that I could hear my own breath and the rain on the canvas. I didn't want tourist trails or other tents nearby. I just wanted to sit in the stillness. I drove up from Leeds on a Wednesday, leaving around 4 a.m. It was raining on and off the whole drive north. The weather report said the Highlands would see scattered rain and strong winds by Thursday evening, but I figured I could set up camp before that hit. The drive took nearly 9 hours. I got to a small town called Kingusi around lunchtime, filled up the tank, bought a couple of last-minute things, more water, a battery pack for my phone even though I didn't expect any signal, and a new gas canister for the stove. From there, I turned off the main road onto a series of narrow, winding paths that got rougher and more isolated the deeper I went. The landscape changed slowly. The green fields turned to patches of woodland, then gave way to wide stretches of heath, moss, and peat. Eventually, I found the rough trail that the backpacker post had mentioned. It wasn't on Google Maps. I only spotted it because someone had nailed a plastic bottle to a tree at the start of it, just as the forum described. I followed it in low gear for almost 25 minutes until I reached the edge of the loch. The whole place was silent except for the wind. There were no tire marks, no footprints. It looked like no one had been there for months. I parked on a patch of dirt behind a line of trees so the car wouldn't be visible from the loch. I walked around with my boots sinking slightly into the wet ground, found a level spot near the tree line, and set up camp. I pitched the tent with the entrance facing the water. I could see the loch maybe 15 feet in front of me. It was about 70 yards wide, bordered on one side by a thick patch of pine trees, and on the other side by a gentle rise that led into the hills. There were no structures anywhere, no fences, no ruins, nothing. I sat out there after dark with my little headlamp on and a cheap camping chair. I made tea on the stove and listened to the wind roll across the water. It got cold quickly after sunset. By 9, I was zipped into my sleeping bag listening to the distant hoot of an owl. The first night went by without anything unusual. I woke once around 3 a.m. because the wind was louder than usual and rain was beating down hard. But that was expected. It's the Highlands. The second day was wetter. I stayed close to the tent, took some photos, made coffee, and read for a while. It was during the evening, around 6:30, when I noticed something strange for the first time. I was crouched down filling the pot with water from the loch, and I saw what looked like a small white plastic wrapper half buried under a stone on the opposite bank. It was far, but I could tell it was something man-made. I figured it could have blown there from anywhere. Litter's not that uncommon, even way out here, but it made me pause. I checked that area earlier and hadn't seen anything. I told myself I just missed it. That night I heard noises, not animal ones, not the natural kind. Around 2 a.m., I was lying in my bag with the rain tapping softly on the tent, and I heard something like fabric brushing on branches. It wasn't the wind. It was slower, then a crack. Not a sharp snap, but the kind of sound a branch makes when someone steps on it carefully. I froze. My heart started racing. It sounded like it came from the tree line behind my tent. I lay there completely still, didn't even breathe deeply. I just listened. The wind picked up, drowning out whatever it was, but the feeling in my gut was hard to ignore. Something had moved out there. I stayed awake for another hour, eyes wide open, ears straining, but the noise didn't come back. Eventually, I must have drifted off. By morning, the ground was soaked. I walked to the edge of the trees behind my tent. I didn't see any footprints or broken branches. Nothing clear. But then again, the rain had washed everything clean. I shook it off, told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe. Later that afternoon, I noticed something else. Someone or something had moved a rock by the water. I knew it because I'd placed it there myself the day before, just for balance while I was washing my mess tin. It had been a large flat stone, but now it was flipped over, revealing damp earth underneath. It hadn't rolled, it was too flat for that. It looked like it had been lifted. There were also two small, oval-shaped indentations near it in the mud, like where someone had knelt. That's when I started to feel truly uneasy. I stood there staring at the spot for nearly 5 minutes. Everything in me wanted to believe there was a normal explanation, but I couldn't come up with one. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the bag, one hand on my pocket knife, the other near my torch. I kept the tent flap slightly open so I could see the outside if the headlamp was on. The wind had died down. The rain was softer, Around 2:30 a.m., I heard it again. Soft movement, slow, deliberate, this time from the direction of the lock. I clicked the torch on and pointed it toward the sound, but the light bounced off the wet ground and tree trunks, showing nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no crunching leaves, just that subtle brush of movement, then silence. I stayed up until dawn, listening, barely breathing. The next morning, I packed up most of my gear. I wasn't about to stay another night. I told myself I'd head out before noon, but when I walked back to the car, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were scuff marks in the dirt around the rear tire, not tire tracks, not animal prints, just dragged marks, like someone had crouched there, maybe knelt. One of the branches I'd broken off a pine tree to cover the back of the car had been moved slightly. 2. It didn't feel random. It felt like someone had been there looking at the car. That was enough for me. I loaded the last of my gear and started the engine. I didn't even stop to eat. As I drove out, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every twist in the trail made me anxious. Every shadow in the trees made me tighten my grip on the wheel. I didn't see anyone. No hikers.
No shepherds.
No one. When I finally got back to Kingusi, I parked in the town square and sat there for a long time, heart still pounding. I tried to make sense of what had happened, but there wasn't much to go on. No clear proof.
No confrontation.
Just that creeping feeling that someone had been out there, watching, maybe more than one night. I drove home the next day, back to my flat in Leeds. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time, not even Josh. I tried to forget it. I tried to tell myself I imagined it, that I let the isolation and bad weather play tricks on me. But here's the part I've never forgotten. A week after I got home, I was sorting through the photos on my phone. I don't remember taking a picture inside the tent at night, but there it was, a blurry image, almost black, but I could make out the corner of my tent and the dim glow from my headlamp. It had been taken around 2:47 a.m. The thing is, I don't remember using my phone that night. I didn't even have it out, and I certainly didn't take a picture. That was the last time I went camping alone. It was late September 2013. I was 33 then, and I'd just taken a week off from my job as a mechanic in Leeds. I needed a break, not from stress or burnout, but just the usual creeping numbness that comes with routine. A friend of mine had mentioned a place called Malorang Valley, tucked between Cumbria and North Yorkshire. Said it was quiet, out of the way, had nice views, and most importantly, no phone reception. That last bit sold it for me. I packed up my car with the essentials: a waterproof tent, food for a few days, a change of clothes, and a sleeping bag thick enough to handle the late autumn cold. I didn't bring anything fancy. No GPS, no special cameras, nothing like that. Just a map, a torch, and a folding knife I kept with me out of habit. By the time I reached the end of the old forestry track where I planned to start hiking up the ridge, it was already raining lightly. The kind of drizzle that feels like mist on your face, but soaks your clothes if you stand in it too long. I parked the car under a crooked tree that looked like it had been struck by lightning years ago and started the short hike uphill. My plan was simple: find a flat area above the tree line, set up camp, spend the night, and head down the next morning before the worst of the weather moved in. The trail was muddy, but not unbearable. I followed an old sheep path that snaked around boulders and gnarled trees, the mist thickening the higher I climbed. The only sounds were the steady tapping of rain on my hood and the occasional bleat of a sheep from somewhere down in the valley. The air smelled clean, earthy. Every now and then I'd step into a puddle that went deeper than expected, soaking my socks, but it didn't bother me much. I brought dry ones. By the time I reached a flat shelf just below the crest of the ridge, it was near dark. I pitched my tent facing away from the wind, anchored it with extra care since the ground was soft, then climbed inside and changed into dry clothes. The inside of the tent steamed up quickly with my body heat. I cooked up a tin of stew over a tiny camp stove, ate, then unrolled my sleeping bag. The rain picked up around midnight, drumming harder against the nylon, and a gust of wind now and then made the whole tent shudder. I remember lying there, warm and dry, watching droplets slide down the inside of the tent wall by torchlight. Then I heard it, a thud, not loud, just definite, solid, not the wind, not rain. I propped myself up on one elbow, holding my breath without meaning to. The rain masked a lot, but I could still hear it, a kind of muffled crunch outside, followed by a pause, then another crunch. Footsteps. Someone or something was walking nearby, not a deer. The rhythm was wrong. 2 steps, a pause, then 3 more. It was circling. I sat completely still, straining to hear. There were no lights outside, just the dark shape of the ridgeline through the thin wall of the tent. The footsteps came closer, stopped. I held my breath. Nothing, just the rain. Then, from behind me, right where the slope steepened into the drop-off, I heard the sound of something slipping, scrabbling for grip. Whatever it was had lost its footing. Stones clattered, a dull thud, then silence. I waited for another minute, maybe 2. Nothing. I thought about unzipping the tent and looking out, but something in me told me not to. It wasn't fear exactly, just caution. Like my body had decided for me. I clicked off the torch and sat in darkness, listening to the storm. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up around 5 a.m. to silence. The rain had stopped. The air was cold, and everything smelled wet and fresh. I stepped out, boots squelching into the mud, and looked around. There were no obvious tracks, just my own leading up to the tent. But about 10 feet away, near the edge of the slope, the ground was churned up. Mud scraped, tufts of grass torn out. Something had slipped there, for sure. It was too early for light, but I could just make out the shape of the valley below. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, not really thinking, just unsettled. I told myself it had been a sheep, maybe a hiker, lost. But even then, no one would be up here in that weather. I hadn't seen a single soul since I left the road. Later that morning, once the sky lightened, I packed up my gear and started back down. The trail had turned to a stream in places, water pouring down the slope. Every now and then I'd glance behind me. I didn't know why. Nothing was there. I made it back to the car around noon. Everything was as I left it. But here's where things got strange. On the driver's side door, just below the window, were 3 long scratches. Thin, straight, and fresh. Not made by a key or knife. Too thin for that. More like a nail, or something like it. The paint was peeled back clean. No mud smears, no fingerprints, just those 3 lines. I stood there a long time, just staring. I looked around. The forest was quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I got in, started the engine, and drove. Didn't stop until I hit the A684 again. I never reported it. What would I even say? I didn't tell my friend either, the one who'd recommended the valley. Just said the weather was rough and I cut the trip short. But that week back home, I couldn't shake it. That feeling, the sounds, the scratches, the silence afterward, stayed with me. 2 months later, in November, I came across a news story. A missing person, a man in his 40s, last seen hiking near Malorang. He was experienced, had all the gear. They found his pack and boots at the bottom of a slope, halfway down the ridge. His body wasn't found. Still hasn't been, as far as I know. I don't know what happened to him. Maybe he slipped in the rain and the current pulled him deeper into the forest. Maybe animals scattered the remains. I don't know. But what I do know is that on that night, I heard something walking around my tent. I heard it fall. And when I got back to my car, something had scratched it. I haven't been camping since, and I don't plan to. I had never been to Albania before 2018. I was 27 back then, and I had taken a long break from my job in Sofia, Bulgaria. I was working freelance in graphic design, and I could take my laptop with me anywhere. That summer, I wanted to get away from everything. Phones, noise, people, all of it. I had been living alone for a while after a rough breakup, and I thought camping somewhere quiet, somewhere I didn't know anyone, would help clear my head. I had read about the accursed mountains in the north of Albania. That name alone made it interesting. They looked peaceful in photos. The villages seemed old, almost frozen in time. I packed my gear, booked a bus, and made my way toward a small village called Faith. I didn't want to camp in a place crowded with tourists, so I stayed one night in the village, then hiked up a narrow path into the higher ridges. I followed a goat trail someone in town told me about. It led into thick woods and eventually opened up near a shallow river and a small clearing surrounded by steep hills. I pitched my tent there, far enough from the village that I couldn't hear anything but the sound of wind and water. It was perfect. There were signs that people sometimes passed through. Faint boot prints, broken branches, old wrappers, but nothing fresh. I didn't see or hear a single person the first full day. I spent it fishing in the cold water, writing, and just lying in the sun on a rock. That night I sat beside a small fire, staring up at the sky for what felt like hours. On the second day, I hiked up one of the nearby ridges. The higher I went, the more rugged the terrain got. Pine trees gave way to rocky slopes, and the air got thinner. I found a strange flat patch near the top, maybe 20 minutes from my camp. It wasn't on the map, and I only found it because I followed a path of broken stones that looked like they had once been steps. In the middle of the clearing was something buried, square-shaped, about 6 feet long, made of cracked cement. It was completely covered in moss and old dirt, like no one had touched it in years. I thought it might be an old bunker or a grave, maybe from the communist era. There were no markings on it, no names, no signs. It gave me a weird feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be near it. I didn't stay long. I went back to camp and didn't tell anyone about it. Not that I had anyone to tell, really. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up every hour. I felt like something was off, like I was being watched. It didn't help that the woods were completely silent. No bugs, no birds, nothing. Around 3 a.m., I heard something move outside my tent. It wasn't a bear. I've heard bears before. This was slow, deliberate, crunching leaves, then stopping. Then another slow step. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I had a knife near my sleeping bag, but I didn't touch it. I waited for the sound to pass. It did eventually, but I didn't sleep again until daylight. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a wild boar. I didn't want to believe it was a person. But the next morning, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Near the river, on the flat, wet stones, there were fresh boot prints. One set. They weren't mine. I hadn't crossed that spot in 2 days. The heel had a specific wear pattern, like it had been used for a long time. Deep tread, wide toe box. Not a local boot, more like something from the army. I checked around the trees, but saw nothing else. No cigarette butts, no signs of a fire. Just the tracks. I packed up my things and moved camp closer to the ridge, about 400 meters uphill, where I could see more of the surrounding woods. I didn't want to be near the river anymore. I didn't feel safe. That second site was tighter, rockier, but I managed to get my tent set up between 2 boulders and used a few fallen branches to build a new fire pit. I stayed near it the whole afternoon and kept my knife and a long stick close. I didn't eat much that day. My stomach was in knots. That night, I built a bigger fire. I stayed awake until the logs turned to glowing red ash. I didn't want darkness around me. I heard movement again, more than once. But every time I stood up and listened, everything went silent. The third time, I turned off my flashlight and sat still, just breathing slowly. I heard one sharp crack in the distance, like a branch breaking under pressure. Then nothing. I didn't sleep again that night either. In the morning, I decided to go back to the cement slab. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I checked it again, I could rule it out as anything strange. When I got there, the moss had been disturbed. Someone had scraped it off in a few places. It wasn't like that before. I looked around the clearing and noticed that one of the small rocks near the slab had been moved. Under it was a crushed tin can, flattened and rusted, but not old enough to be from the war. Maybe 10 years old. Someone had hidden it there. I started to get the idea that I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. Maybe this place was used for something or still was. I didn't feel like a tourist anymore. I felt like a target. I went back to camp and packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I decided to hike back to Faith, even if it meant getting there after dark. I didn't care. I didn't want to be up in those woods one more night. As I followed the trail down, I realized something else. There were no fresh signs of my original path. No broken twigs.
No footprints.
It was like the forest had erased everything, or like someone had covered it up. I picked up my pace. My pack felt heavier. The air felt thicker. I kept checking behind me every few minutes. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following at a distance, just out of view. I made it down to the base of the trail just after sunset. But before I reached the main road, I found something else. Tied to a tree with old string was a shirt. My shirt. One I had washed in the river and left hanging on a low branch to dry. It had been taken from my old camp. That meant someone had gone there after I left. They had followed me. They had taken something, then tied it up where I would see it. A message. I didn't sleep in Faith. I walked right through the village and flagged down the first truck I saw. It was a farmer heading west to Skoder. I paid him whatever cash I had left and got out of those mountains. I didn't go to the police. What would I tell them? That someone followed me and moved my shirt? That I found a weird slab of cement and heard footsteps at night? They would have laughed at me or ignored it. Maybe worse. A week later, I was back in Sofia, still thinking about that place. I looked up old maps, tried to find out if the area had any military history. I found a document from the late 80s that showed several unmarked sites in northern Albania. Suspected black sites or hidden storage used by the Hoxha regime. Some of them matched the ridge I camped near. One line in the document caught my eye. It said, *, do not disturb the slabs. They are sealed for a reason. *, I never went back to Albania. I never went camping alone again. Even now, 7 years later, sometimes I dream about that sound. A single step, then nothing. And always, in the dream, the moss has been scraped away. I was 33 when it happened, in the late summer of 2014. I had taken 2 weeks off from my job at a distribution warehouse in Denver. Back then, I didn't have much going for me. No wife, no kids, just me, my old Ford F-150, and a secondhand tent that smelled like mildew. I needed the break. Life had felt like a copy of itself for months. Same routes, same packed lunches, same clock-in, clock-out routine. I decided to drive down into New Mexico, explore the desert near the Four Corners area, and spend a few nights camping in remote spots where I wouldn't see anyone else. I picked a place about 20 miles northwest of Shiprock. I'd looked it up on maps and satellite images. It wasn't a campground or anything official, just flat, dry land that dipped into sparse canyons, with scattered trees and crumbling rock formations. There were no signs, no fencing, nothing but dust and open sky. It was exactly what I wanted. The first night went by without anything unusual. I set up camp next to a dry wash. I could see the wide, flat top of Shiprock in the distance like a massive stone claw reaching out of the desert. The sun went down quickly, the way it always does in open land. There was no glow from city lights, no hum of traffic. It was pure silence. Just the wind and the occasional call of something out there, maybe coyotes. I remember sitting in my camp chair, sipping cheap whiskey and looking at the stars. They felt endless, like they were pressing down from above. I liked it at first, the quiet, but after an hour or so, it started to feel too quiet, like the silence was watching me. On the second day, I hiked out toward a small ridge to get a better view of the landscape. I found old bones near the base of a shallow ravine, sun-bleached and broken in half. I guess they were from a cow or a deer, maybe dragged there by predators. That's not too strange out in that part of the world. But something about the way they were arranged struck me. They weren't scattered like an animal would leave them. The skull had been set upright, facing east, and the leg bones were standing upright in the dirt, like stakes. I didn't touch them. I backed away slowly and returned to camp. That night was different. The wind was dead still. The air had this heaviness to it, like a storm was building, but there were no clouds. I kept hearing noises, not far-off animal sounds, but movement. Fast, quiet movement, like something circling my camp just beyond the reach of the firelight. I turned off my lantern and listened. Nothing. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crack, like a branch snapping in half. I jumped to my feet and pointed my flashlight in the direction it came from. There was nothing there, just the bare trunks of twisted junipers and the dirt that looked gray under the beam. I turned in a full circle, lighting up the edges of camp, my heart pounding. I saw nothing, but I felt something, like I was being watched from the dark, from somewhere low to the ground. The next morning, I found footprints, human ones, barefoot. The prints were long, narrow, and deep in the dry soil, circling the fire pit. They hadn't been there before. I walked a wide ring around camp, looking for where they started. They just appeared about 20 feet from my tent and disappeared again maybe 15 feet further out. No trail leading to them, no return path, just a broken circle like someone had come out of the ground, stared at my tent, and slipped away again. I didn't pack up right away. I told myself it was just a trick of the wind or some kid messing around. But that night, I didn't light a fire. I stayed in the tent, zipped up tight. I had a hunting knife and a tire iron, and I kept both beside me in the sleeping bag. I didn't sleep. I lay there, listening, trying to breathe as quietly as I could. At some point around 2 a.m., I heard what I thought was whispering. Not words, not even language, just soft, rasping murmurs. They circled the tent, low and steady. I held my breath. Then I heard it step on one of my empty beer cans. The crunch made me sit straight up. I could see the silhouette through the fabric of the tent, tall and narrow, bent at the middle. It didn't move like a person. It moved like something trying to remember how to move like a person. One long leg, pause, then a weird jerk of the upper body, followed by the next step. Stayed there, maybe 5 feet from me, just breathing. The sound of its breath was wrong. Fast, shallow, desperate. Then it started sniffing, long and slow, pressed its head against the tent. I could see the shape of it pushing in, long and flat with no clear face. I don't know how I didn't scream. I held still. I clutched the tire iron so tight my fingers cramped. After a minute or two, it backed away and disappeared into the night. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I finally stepped out of the tent. There were more footprints, more beer cans crushed flat. My gear had been moved, just shifted a little, like someone had picked things up and set them back down an inch to the left. My backpack had been unzipped. Nothing taken, just opened. My cooler had a single claw mark on the lid. I broke camp fast and drove out. I didn't stop until I hit Farmington and booked a room in a rundown motel off the main road. I thought that was it. I thought I'd escaped it. But that night in the motel, I heard something tapping on the window. I was on the second floor. I didn't look. I didn't open the curtains. I left before sunrise and drove straight back to Denver. I told myself I was just sleep deprived, that it had all been in my head, that maybe it was a mountain lion or a drifter. But 2 weeks later, I found a long, narrow footprint outside my apartment window. My place was on the third floor, and there was no balcony. I moved not long after that. I deleted all the photos I'd taken on that trip. Every single one. Years have gone by, and I've never camped again. I don't tell this story to many people. Most wouldn't believe it. But I know what I saw. I know how it moved, how it sounded, and I know it's still out there, somewhere near Shiprock, waiting, watching. It never needed to talk. It just needed to look like something familiar, something close enough to human to pass in the dark, until it didn't want to anymore. I used to think skinwalkers were just stories, old tales to scare kids or keep people out of sacred land. Not anymore. Not after that. Now I keep the lights on at night. I never camp. I never go near New Mexico. And when I see shadows move too smoothly, too slow, I make sure I'm not alone. Because once you see it, really see it, you never forget how wrong a human shape can look when something else is wearing it. And you never stop wondering if it followed you home. I was 34 the summer I decided to drive down through Arizona and spend a week hiking through Tonto National Forest. I've been saving up vacation days for 2 years, and with no real obligations tying me down, it just made sense. I'd camped all over the Northwest before, Washington, Oregon, Montana, but never this far south, never in this kind of dry, sun-cracked country. It was July 2016. I remember that clearly because of how the heat felt different from anything I'd known. It wasn't just hot. It was punishing, like it wanted to wear you down. Even the breeze didn't feel like a break, just more heat in motion. Still, I was prepared. I'd brought 6 gallons of water in the back of my truck, a reliable backpacking stove, a satellite phone, just in case, and enough dry food to last 9 days if needed. I wasn't trying to be reckless. I wanted solitude, that's all. I started my hike from a dirt turnoff near State Route 288, north of Roosevelt Lake. The first 2 days went by without much incident. The trails were dry and winding, and the trees sparse but tall. I made camp near a dried-up riverbed on the second night, and I could tell no one had been around that area in weeks, maybe months. There were no tire tracks, no boot prints, just coyote scat and the occasional sun-bleached animal bone. It was the kind of silence I liked. That second night, I sat outside my tent under a canopy of quiet stars, sipping warm instant coffee from my dented metal cup. I could hear the faint clicking of insects in the brush and the occasional distant bark of something. Maybe a fox, maybe a stray dog. I felt safe. The third day is when everything began to change. I'd hiked deeper into a patch of forest that grew unusually thick for that part of the state. It wasn't on the main trails. I'd taken a side path I saw on an old topo map, a ridge trail that curved around the back of a steep slope called Wren's Hollow. I remember the name because it sounded peaceful at the time. The path up was narrow, but the view from the ridge was incredible. The forest stretched on for miles, red and yellow rock formations piercing the canopy like frozen thunderclouds. I walked along the ridge for most of the afternoon, stopping only to snap a few pictures and eat some trail mix. By late evening, I made camp just off the ridge, down in a shallow bowl of trees surrounded on 3 sides by low hills. It was shaded and flat. I pitched the tent by a boulder and set up a small fire ring. It was quiet, too quiet in a way. Not eerie at first, just empty. That night, I slept hard. I remember waking up once, maybe around 2 a.m., to the sound of crunching twigs somewhere outside. I lay still for a long time, listening. It didn't sound big. Maybe a rabbit or a raccoon. It didn't linger. I heard it stop, then nothing. I told myself it was nothing. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. About 30 feet from my tent, just at the edge of a cluster of oaks, I saw a small pile of rocks. They hadn't been there the night before. I would have noticed. They were stacked with strange care, about knee-high, and at the very top was a sun-dried bird skull, probably a crow. His beak pointed straight at my tent. I stood there for a while, just staring. I didn't touch it. First, I tried to brush it off. Maybe some past hiker had left it and the wind had uncovered it. But the dust on the stones was fresh. There were no footprints nearby, just mine. The ground was so dry that any step would leave a mark. I checked. Nothing. Something about the way the skull faced my tent made me feel like I was being watched. I packed up early that morning and decided to keep moving. I didn't want to linger in Wren's Hollow any longer than I had to. I told myself it was probably just coincidence. A dead bird. Some bored teen or old hiker playing games weeks ago. Still, I kept checking over my shoulder every few minutes as I made my way down the slope. The trail below the ridge was tougher, steeper. I found myself navigating over dry creek beds and thorny shrubs. After several hours of hiking, I realized I'd taken a wrong turn. The ridge had vanished behind me, and I wasn't seeing any of the trail markers I'd expected to find near Big Canyon. That's when I spotted the shack. It wasn't marked on any of my maps. It wasn't old either, at least not old like abandoned ghost town old. The structure looked hand-built, maybe 20 years back, but sturdy. Thick wooden slats, a corrugated tin roof, and a short overhang at the front. The door was shut. I stood there for 10 minutes, just staring at it. It wasn't creepy in the usual sense. It was too plain, too practical. But something about it felt wrong. Like it didn't belong there. Like it had been hidden on purpose. I didn't go inside. I wanted to. Curiosity burned in me. But the air around it felt heavy, and I couldn't explain it. Instead, I took a wide circle around the shack and moved further down the valley, keeping it behind me. I made camp near a narrow bend in a creek that night. There wasn't much moonlight, and the woods felt darker than usual. I didn't light a fire. Something about the day had shaken my nerves. I crawled into the tent early and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easy. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. They were slow, careful. Crunch, pause, crunch. Not an animal, not a deer, not on two legs. I lay frozen, heart racing, staring up at the dark nylon ceiling of the tent. I could hear the steps circling, sometimes close, sometimes further away. I thought I could make out a faint sound, almost like breathing. They stopped after maybe 10 minutes. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When dawn came, I got out of the tent, knife in hand, scanning the area. No one was there. No signs of boots, no broken branches. But someone had been there. I could feel it in my gut. That morning, I decided to cut the trip short. I didn't want to push deeper. I'd seen enough. I marked the shack's location on my GPS, just for reference, and headed west toward where I knew one of the larger trails eventually met with a fire road. It would be a long hike, maybe 2 full days, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. By late afternoon, the temperature had climbed past 105. The trail was dry, and my water reserves were down to half. I came across an old animal trail and followed it, hoping it would lead to a shaded spot for the night. Instead, it led me back to Wren's Hollow. I didn't realize it at first, not until I saw that same pile of rocks. The skull was gone now, but the stones were there, rearranged, this time in a small circle. I don't know how I ended up back there. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't looped. My GPS had glitched, frozen up, then restarted hours later. I couldn't make sense of it. The sun dipped low again. I didn't want to camp, but I was too tired to keep going. That night, I barely slept. I kept the knife beside me, and every sound outside the tent made my chest tighten. Just before sunrise, I opened my eyes and saw the silhouette of a man standing just outside my tent. Still, tall, not moving. He was maybe 15 feet away. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I blinked hard, once. When I looked again, he was gone. I rushed outside, heart pounding. Nothing. But this time, there were footprints. Deep, fresh boot prints in the dirt, circling the tent twice. They led off toward the ridge and vanished into the rocks. I didn't eat that morning. I packed fast, kept the knife in one hand and a trekking pole in the other, and started moving west. I didn't care if I followed a trail or not. I followed the sun. By noon, I found an old barbed wire fence and followed it south, eventually crossing a dried cattle path that led to a rusty metal gate. Beyond it was a dirt road. I nearly cried. That road eventually led to a closed-off fire station shack. No one was there, but a busted satellite dish and old sign told me I wasn't far from civilization. I hiked 2 more hours before reaching a paved road. A utility truck passed by, and I flagged it down. The driver didn't say much, just gave me water and dropped me at a gas station another 15 miles down the highway. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I didn't report the shack. I didn't talk about the man or the rocks or the way I somehow ended up back in that same hollow. But I never camped alone again. A year later, I looked up Wren's Hollow online. It wasn't listed on any recent maps. No hiking blogs mentioned it. Nothing about an old shack.
No incidents.
Just an old note from a 1992 forest maintenance report saying the area was rarely accessed due to unreliable trail markers and overgrowth. I don't know who built that shack. I don't know who circled my tent. But someone was living out there or watching, waiting, and I was just another idiot who wandered too close. Now, whenever I think about going back into the woods, even up north, I feel something tighten in my chest. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some paths should stay forgotten. And if you ever find yourself near a place that doesn't feel quite right, where the air feels still and too quiet, turn around. I didn't, and I'm lucky I made it back. It was late September 2011 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through southern Utah. I was 34 back then. I'd gone through a bad breakup 2 months earlier, and I needed some space. The kind of space where your phone doesn't work and the air smells like rock and dust. I wanted isolation, total silence, nothing but canyons and stars. I worked as a field tech for a civil engineering firm out of Salt Lake, so I knew my way around topography and maps. I'd been all over the desert and backcountry of the Four Corners region. This wasn't something new for me. I was used to harsh terrain and remote areas. I liked the feeling of being far away from everything. Sometimes that feeling gave me more peace than people ever could. I drove my old 4Runner south, cutting through small desert towns until I got close to the San Rafael Swell. But instead of heading toward the more well-known parts of it, like Goblin Valley or Little Wild Horse Canyon, I took a side road off Highway 24 that led deep into BLM land. No cell service, no rangers, just rough trails and silence. I parked near a dry wash that twisted through low red cliffs and set up camp about a quarter mile from the road. Far enough that no one would see me, but close enough that I could find my truck if I had to leave in the dark. There were old juniper trees scattered across the rocky soil, and the sandstone cliffs created a kind of natural bowl around me. The place felt untouched. I spent the first day hiking, taking photos, and scribbling in a little notebook I always carried. I didn't see anyone, not even tire tracks. That night, I built a small fire and sat under the stars. The air cooled fast after sunset, like it always does in the high desert. The wind picked up a little, brushing through the trees with a dry, whispering sound. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent and zipped the door shut. I wasn't scared or nervous. I'd done this kind of trip at least a dozen times, probably more. I fell asleep listening to the sound of the wind rattling through the dry brush. But sometime after midnight, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that got me up, not exactly. It was the feeling of being watched. That cold tension in the back of your neck, the way your brain senses something before your body understands why. My tent was zipped shut, and the moonlight cast a faint glow through the nylon, but I couldn't see outside. I lay still and held my breath, listening. The wind was gone, dead calm, total silence. That was the first thing that felt wrong. There's always some sound out there. Bugs, wind, a distant owl. But it was like everything had just stopped. I strained to hear anything. A footstep, rustling leaves, even my own heartbeat. Then I heard something move outside the tent. Just one step, not a branch falling or an animal scurrying. An actual step, slow and deliberate. The ground was mostly loose rock and packed dirt, so the sound was clear. A crunch, followed by stillness. Then another crunch. It sounded like bare feet on dry gravel. I didn't move. I kept my breathing shallow and listened. Whoever or whatever it was, they were circling the tent. Not fast, just a slow, careful walk around the nylon shell I was laying in. My brain went into overdrive trying to explain it. Maybe another hiker? No one knew I was here. Maybe an animal? But no animal walks in a circle like that. It circled the tent once, then stopped directly at the back corner, behind my head. I could hear breathing ragged and slow, not panting like a coyote or heavy like a bear, but shallow and wheezy, like someone who just sprinted and was trying to stay quiet. I thought about unzipping the tent, but every cell in my body screamed not to. I wasn't armed. I had a knife, sure, but it was in my pack outside the tent. The only thing I had inside with me was a flashlight. I stayed like that for hours, frozen, barely blinking. At some point, I must have dozed off from exhaustion because I woke up again to the early light just before sunrise. When I stepped outside, everything looked normal. Nothing was disturbed. No footprints, no broken branches. Just wind-blown dirt and the faint orange light of dawn creeping over the cliffs. I told myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a mountain lion, though they don't circle people like that. Maybe a coyote. Maybe I'd imagined the footsteps. I convinced myself to stay another night. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want fear to dictate my plans. That day, I stayed close to camp. I didn't hike far. I kept my knife on me and checked behind me more often than I normally would. The air felt different, charged somehow. I'd been in storms before, and it felt like that, like the air was waiting for something. I made a bigger fire that night. I set out a ring of rocks around the tent and left a few sticks and stones balanced upright outside, the way you might set a trap to see if anything moves. I didn't expect much. I just needed something, anything, that would show me I wasn't losing my mind. I didn't even try to sleep right away. I sat by the fire until it died down to glowing embers, then climbed into the tent just after midnight. I kept the flashlight in my hand and left the zipper partially open so I could peek out. This time, I didn't fall asleep. About an hour later, I heard the footsteps again. Same slow, measured crunch of gravel. Same direction, starting behind the tent and circling to the front. But this time I looked. I pulled the zipper down an inch and peered out into the night. There was something standing just beyond the fire pit. It was hard to make out, just a tall, hunched shape. Not broad like a bear, not quick like a deer. It was human-sized, maybe taller, but the way it moved wasn't right. His body looked thin, almost too thin. The limbs seemed too long, like its arms hung lower than they should. It took one step forward into the moonlight, and I saw something that still makes my stomach twist even now. The skin looked stretched, like it didn't fit right, almost like it had been pulled tight over bones. There was no clothing.
No gear. No pack.
Just pale, leathery skin and a face I couldn't see clearly, except for the eyes. The eyes reflected the light like an animal's would, glowing faintly in the dark. It didn't make a sound, not a word, just stood there, tilting its head in small jerking movements, like it was studying me. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just watched it, my hand clutching the flashlight, finger ready to turn it on. Then it crouched down, not fast but smooth, and pressed one long arm to the ground. It stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds, then stood again and walked off into the darkness without a sound. I didn't sleep. I waited until sunrise, packed up everything, and left. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even check to see if anything was missing. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. When I got back to my truck, I noticed something that made my skin go cold. There were prints in the dirt. Not boot prints, bare feet. Long, narrow feet with visible toes. At least 3 sets going in different directions. One set had walked right up to the driver's side door and stopped. I drove nonstop until I hit a gas station with cell service. I didn't tell anyone. Not then. Not for years. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what I saw. Maybe it was a person. Maybe some drifter out in the middle of nowhere. But who wanders barefoot through cactus and rock in the middle of the night? Who watches people sleep and doesn't leave a trace? Over time, I came across stories.
Navajo legends. Skinwalker tales.
People talked about creatures that could wear the skin of others, mimic shapes, take on forms. Most of it sounded like fantasy, but some of it matched what I saw. The shape, the way it moved, the silence. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it was real. I still go camping, but never alone. Not anymore, and I never go back to southern Utah. I was 32 that summer. I'd been working remote for over a year, and the stress had started to wear me down more than I thought it would. Everything felt tight. The emails, the fake smiles in video meetings, the cold dinners, the shallow sleep. I just needed to disappear for a few days. No phone, no reception, just my own breath and the sound of wind moving through trees. So I packed my old gear, loaded the rucksack into the back of the Jeep, and left early one morning in late September. The plan was simple. Drive up to the ridge above Loch Craiglin in northern Wales. Hike 3 hours west into the lesser-used woods where there were no formal campsites. Pitch the tent and stay out there for 2 nights. I'd done solo hikes and campouts before, but never this far away from people. That was the point. The air was sharp that morning, with a light mist hanging above the narrow road as I climbed higher into the hills. I'd driven this way once before years back with an ex, but I barely remembered it. There was a small gravel turnoff just past a weather-worn wooden sign that read Craiglin East Track, and I pulled over and killed the engine. After tightening the straps on my bag and double-checking that I had my knife, headlamp, and rain tarp, I locked the Jeep, hid the keys inside a sealed bag under the rear fender, and started walking west into the forest. The trail started clear and well used, but within the first hour it had turned into a faint line of mud and moss winding through birch and spruce. The deeper I went, the darker it got. Not in a haunted way, just the way woods get when they're left alone long enough. No cut trees, no footprints, just old bark, mushrooms, wet ferns, and the occasional snap of a branch under my boot. I found a small rise in the land beside a half-dried stream just before dusk. It was the kind of spot you look for, slightly elevated, soft moss underfoot, no big dead limbs above. I set the tent up quickly, clipped the fly down with thick stones, and stretched out a length of camo tarp between 2 trees to shield a dry, sitting area where I could boil water. By the time I got the fire started with my little alcohol stove, the sky had gone a solid gray. The clouds were thick and low. It wasn't dramatic, just a silent shift. I boiled a bit of rice, added a sealed pack of tuna, and ate sitting cross-legged under the tarp, staring out at the trees while the first drops of rain began hitting the leaves. The smell of wet bark and old moss came in waves. I wasn't scared. Not then. By 9 p.m., the rain had picked up. Not hard, just steady, like someone wringing a sponge over the woods. I climbed into my sleeping bag inside the tent, zipped the fly fully shut, and clicked off my headlamp. The sound of water on nylon and leaves was almost comforting. I fell asleep faster than I expected. The first thing that woke me was the wind. Not the normal kind that moves gently through trees, but the heavy, irregular kind that dips and yanks and seems to shove the woods around in sudden bursts. It was sometime after midnight. I checked my watch. 1:14 a.m. The rain had turned heavier too. I could hear it hitting the tent like a low, endless drum roll. The wind gusts kept making the tarp flap against the line, slapping every 10 or 15 seconds. Then it'd go silent again. I wasn't afraid. Not exactly, but I couldn't fall back asleep. My mind started to churn. I thought I heard something moving just outside the tent. Not loud, more like a light shuffle or crunch. At first, I told myself it was a deer or maybe just water dripping from a branch, but I couldn't ignore the pattern. 2 steps, stop, then another 2. It wasn't animal-like. It sounded like walking, careful walking. I stayed perfectly still inside the bag, holding my breath. There was no light, no shadows. The tent was zipped shut, and with the rain and wind, it was hard to tell exactly how close the sound was. But it had weight to it, like someone stepping deliberately through wet ground, slow and cautious, like they didn't want to be heard. I reached quietly for the knife I kept near the side pouch. Just a small one, enough to cut rope or whittle sticks, but still better than nothing. I lay there listening, heart thudding in my ears, trying not to make the nylon rustle. The steps stopped. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. Then there was nothing, just rain and wind. At some point, I must have dozed off again out of pure exhaustion. I woke up around dawn. Not to any noise, but to that strange feeling in the body when something isn't quite right. It was cold. The inside of the tent was damp. I unzipped the fly, stepped out, and noticed immediately that the tarp had collapsed. One of the lines had been untied, not snapped, not ripped out, just untied. The knot I'd tied the night before was a double half hitch. I'd been doing that for years. It doesn't come undone in wind unless it's soaked for days. This was loose, clean, sitting on the moss like someone had unwrapped it carefully and laid the cord down without tension. I felt a deep tightness crawl through my stomach. I checked the rest of the site. Nothing else was touched. No footprints, but with the rain and the spongy ground, that didn't mean anything. My stove was still in place. My dry food bag, which I'd hung on a tree limb, was still sealed. But that tarp line, I kept coming back to it. I told myself it could have been me. Maybe I didn't secure it right. Maybe it just slipped. But I didn't believe that. That whole day I stayed close to camp. I gathered more dry twigs under thicker trees. I kept the knife in my pocket. I barely ate. I didn't want to. The woods felt different now, heavier. The wind kept coming in strange bursts, and even during calm periods, I had this crawling sense like I was being watched. Every time I turned toward the trees, I expected to see someone standing there, but there was never anything. That night, I didn't sleep. The rain started again around 10 p.m. The air was colder. I sat inside the tent with my jacket on, wrapped in the sleeping bag, just listening. No headphones. No music, just the wind and rain and my own heartbeat. I kept the headlamp off. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Movement, soft steps in the dark. It was slower this time, closer. I stayed completely still. My hand gripped the knife hard enough to make my palm sweat. The sound came around the side of the tent, just outside. Then it stopped again. A minute later, I heard something new. The sound of my dry bag's clip being unfastened. The food bag. I sat up slowly and leaned toward the tent wall. I could just barely make out the shape of something moving near the tree where I'd hung it. The rain made everything shimmer and blur, but I could see the motion, not animal motion. Upright, careful. I stayed still. The shape moved away, vanishing into the black trees. I waited another 20 minutes before moving. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, the food bag was on the ground, unopened but taken down from the branch. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed crouched under the tarp, knife in hand, headlamp ready but turned off, watching, listening, waiting for light. The first light, I packed everything. Fast. I didn't cook. I didn't eat. I stuffed the wet tarp into the side of my bag, rolled the soaked tent without shaking it off, and got the hell out of there. I didn't look back. The walk back took longer than it should have. I kept checking behind me, scanning the trees, listening for anything out of place. But there was nothing, just wet forest and cold wind. When I got back to the Jeep, I felt a wave of relief so strong I nearly dropped my pack. But then I noticed something. The rear tire had been slashed. Not burst, not popped. Slashed. Clean and deliberate. Right across the sidewall. The keys were still in the sealed bag under the fender, untouched. But the tire, that changed everything. I didn't have reception. The spare was on the back, but I'd never changed a tire in rain this bad, and the slope of the gravel didn't help. Took me over an hour, kneeling in mud and getting soaked to the bone, hands shaking, trying to wedge the jack under the axle. I kept turning around, checking the tree lean, convinced someone was watching. When I finally got the tire on and started the engine, I didn't waste a second. I drove straight down, fast and tight around the bends, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't stop until I reached the first petrol station back on the A487. I pulled in under the awning, climbed out, and just stood there in the light, soaked and shivering, heart still pounding. I reported the incident to the local police the next morning. I gave them the exact spot where I'd camped, told them about the food bag, the footsteps, the tire, everything. They wrote it down. They told me it was probably just a trespasser or someone squatting in the woods. Maybe a drifter. They said they'd send someone up if they had time. I never heard back. I haven't gone camping since. Not alone. Not in that part of Wales. Not in the rain. Sometimes I think about the knot. The way it was untied. So quiet. So careful. Like whoever did it had done it before. Like it wasn't the first tent they'd crept up on out there. And maybe not the last. It was late September 2014, and the days were starting to feel shorter in that quiet stretch of the English countryside. I was 27 at the time, not really looking for adventure, but always the type to chase solitude. My name's Adam, and back then I had a habit of going camping in unusual places. Not for the thrill, not to impress anyone, but because being alone out there helped me quiet my head. Some people drink. Others drown in music. I pitched tents. It made me feel grounded in a strange way. The colder the wind, the more open the sky, the better I felt. That weekend, I drove out toward a small village in North Yorkshire. The name won't matter. It's the kind of place where houses look like they've been there a few hundred years, and the only pub in town shuts its doors at 9. It wasn't my first time there. I'd passed through before, and I remembered this old graveyard tucked away behind a broken stone wall on a hill just outside the village. It wasn't big, maybe 40, 50 headstones. Some leaned, some were worn to the point of being unreadable, but it was quiet and tucked away. That's what drew me in. The graveyard had no gates, just a wide gap in the stone wall and a muddy path that curved up past overgrown bushes. There were no signs, no recent flowers. Most of the graves looked like they hadn't been visited in decades. I knew it was a bit off to set up a tent in a place like that, but I told myself it wasn't disrespectful if I wasn't bothering anything. I wasn't there to vandalize or take pictures. I just wanted silence. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the light started to turn gold. I parked off the main road near a hedgerow, far enough that no one driving by would notice. Then I hiked the last half mile with my pack and gear. The graveyard was exactly as I remembered. Still, forgotten, cradled by the woods on one side and open farmland on the other. I walked around for a while before settling on a flat bit of grass near the far edge. I wasn't right on top of any graves, just a little corner near a stone that had cracked down the middle. A row of tall, thin trees bordered that side, and I figured they'd help block the wind. The air had that damp autumn chill, and the clouds were hanging low like they might turn to rain overnight. I liked that. Nothing felt better than zipping into a warm sleeping bag while hearing drizzle hit the tent. I set everything up, pitched the tent, rolled out the mat, stacked up some firewood I brought with me. I don't usually light fires when I camp, especially not near places like that, but it was cold enough I figured it wouldn't hurt. I made a small one, shielded from the wind by a ring of stones. I boiled water for tea and ate a cold meal from a tin. As night settled in, the landscape around me faded into shadows. The open field beyond the stone wall was swallowed by darkness, and the tree-line behind me turned into one long black shape. I didn't have any signal on my phone. That was expected. I turned it off and tucked it into my backpack. The last thing I saw on the screen before it went black was the time, 7:41 p.m. It was quiet, almost too quiet.
No owls. No rustling.
Just a slow breeze moving through the branches. I sat for a long while watching the fire die out, listening to the pop of wood and the occasional distant creak of trees moving. Felt peaceful at first, the kind of peace I used to crave. But after a while, I started feeling, not watched exactly, just aware. Aware of the stillness, aware of how the ground felt under me, how the stones looked in the dark. I don't usually spook easy, but something about sitting in that place made my skin feel tight, like it was reacting to something I couldn't name. When the fire dropped to glowing embers, I poured water on it, packed away the bits I wouldn't need till morning, and got into the tent. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, pulled the hood tight over my head, and tried to settle in. I didn't sleep, not right away. I lay there listening. There were no animal sounds, no wind whistling through the trees, but I kept thinking I could hear something faint. It wasn't clear, just a sound like pressure moving through the air. At first, I told myself it was in my head, like when you lie in bed too long and the sound of your own blood starts to echo. But this wasn't that. This had rhythm, not footsteps exactly, but weight. I knew the ground outside was uneven and covered in old roots and stones. Nothing would walk quietly across that, not even a fox. Whatever this was, it was careful, controlled. I lay there holding my breath, straining to hear. It would come, then stop. Come again, then stop again. Never close, never far, always just beyond the tent. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to be the wind catching tree limbs or some sort of small animal. Maybe a badger or hedgehog rooting around. It didn't feel logical, but logic has a way of helping you ignore things when you need to sleep. After a while, the rhythm stopped completely. I still lay there waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. That was somehow worse. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke to complete darkness. Not the kind where your eyes just haven't adjusted yet, but pitch black, not even moonlight slipping through the fabric of the tent. The air felt colder. My breath made a soft cloud inside the bag. I reached for my phone to check the time, but when I turned it on, the screen stayed black. I tried holding the power button. Nothing. It had been fully charged. That bothered me more than it should have. I sat up slowly, unzipped the tent just a little to peek out. Blackness. Not quiet, though. I could hear something now. A creaking sound. Slow, steady, strained like something heavy swinging from a high point. It wasn't metal. It sounded more like old wood, like a tree with a branch caught on something. I stared out, trying to see shapes, but the fire had gone cold and there was no light from the sky. It was like being inside ink. Then came the crack. Not loud, but sharp, like something stepped on a dry twig directly outside. I stayed frozen, breathing through my nose, not daring to move. Every part of my body had gone cold, not from temperature but from instinct. I know what it feels like when your body picks up on something your brain can't name. I knew I wasn't alone. I waited. 10 minutes, maybe 20. Time moved strangely. I never heard retreating steps, just one sound, then stillness again. I wanted to believe it had passed, that whatever it was had moved on. But when I finally unzipped the tent fully and looked out again, there was a new smell in the air. Dampness mixed with earth, but also something sour, like meat just starting to turn. I stepped outside, boots crunching softly against grass and frost. My flashlight flicked on, beam shaking with my hand. There were no footprints, but near one of the older headstones, the ground looked disturbed. Not dug up, not messy, just different, like someone had walked back and forth there, pressing the soil in. I circled the graveyard with the light, checking the wall, the trees, the grass, looking for animals or anything else that could have made the sound. Nothing. No tracks, no shapes in the distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there while I was inside the tent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat with my back against the tent, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. I stared into the dark until morning finally peeled the blackness away. When the light came, it was soft and gray. I stood, stiff and tired, and walked back toward the spot where I thought I heard the noises. That disturbed patch of ground now had a new line through it, straight, narrow, like a dragged stick. I hadn't made that. That was the last straw. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, barely stopping to roll the mat. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just got out, hiked straight back to the car, soaked with sweat despite the cold, feeling watched every step of the way. The car started fine. The phone turned on again as soon as I plugged it into the charger. Time read 6:03 a.m. It still had 80% battery. I didn't go back to that village. I never reported anything. I didn't know what to report. No one would have believed me. Maybe someone was living out there in the woods. Maybe a local knew I was camping and decided to scare me off. But it didn't feel like a prank. It didn't feel like a joke. It felt like something that wanted me gone, without making a sound. And it worked. I haven't camped near graveyards since. I was 31 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip through New Mexico. This was in the summer of 2017. At that time, I was living in Flagstaff, Arizona, working a construction job that gave me a few weeks off between projects. I'd been through a rough few months, some stress at work, a long relationship that ended on bad terms, and a general need to be away from people. I wasn't trying to find myself or any of that crap. I just wanted quiet, somewhere far enough from traffic noise, phone reception, and other people's voices. I picked an area in the Hila National Forest. I didn't want the main campsites with all the marked trails and fire pits and busy parking areas. I wanted something off the grid, but still within reasonable walking distance to a Forest Service road. After reading some posts on forums and checking some backroad maps, I settled on a spot near a dirt access road labeled NF 139D, not far from Turkey Feather Pass. I didn't know anyone who had actually camped there, but the area looked right. forested, remote, and mostly ignored. I left early on a Tuesday morning, just after sunrise. My gear was packed in the back of my old Toyota 4Runner: tent, sleeping bag, stove, freeze-dried food, a few bottles of water, and a large jug for backup. I also brought a small hatchet, a decent knife, and a .45 handgun I kept in a locked box under the seat. I wasn't some paranoid survivalist, but I believed in being ready. I'd seen enough weird situations on previous trips to know that peace of mind is worth the extra weight. The drive took a few hours. As I passed Silver City, the road got worse. Asphalt turned to gravel, gravel to dirt, and eventually just a series of ruts that weaved between trees and low brush. By early afternoon, I found a turnout that looked promising. It was nothing official, just a patch where the trees opened up, with an old fire ring made of blackened stones and some broken branches scattered around. It was quiet, surrounded by tall pines and brush. No tire marks, no wrappers, no signs anyone had been there in a long while. I parked the 4Runner beside a wide stump and walked a slow circle around the clearing. Everything seemed normal. No trash, no buzz of flies around anything dead. Just trees, wind, and a lot of stillness. That first evening was exactly what I needed. I set up camp, made some instant noodles, and sat on a flat rock until the sun dipped behind the trees. When the air cooled and the sky turned dark, I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent and closed my eyes. Around midnight, I woke up needing to piss. I stepped outside and walked a short way from the tent, peeing into the brush and glancing around with my flashlight. It was quiet, not dead silent. There were night bugs, a few owl calls, the distant rustle of wind through dry needles, but it was calm. I went back inside and slept until the early light started to rise again. The next day passed without anything strange. I made some coffee on my little stove and walked around the area a bit. I followed an old animal trail for maybe half an hour, then came back and sat near the fire ring carving at a piece of pine bark with my knife. I didn't have a schedule, no goal, just quiet. Later in the afternoon, I heard something strange, a low crunching sound from deeper in the trees. I assumed it was an elk or maybe a black bear. I stood still for a bit, watching in the direction of the noise, but nothing showed. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I went back to camp. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I heard movement outside the tent around 2 in the morning. Not walking, more like brushing. The sound of something or someone moving slow and close. I laid there in my bag, listening hard, holding my breath. The crunch of needles, a faint shift in the air. I reached into the side pocket of the tent and pulled out my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I waited. The noise went on for maybe a minute or two, then faded. I never heard anything run off. Never heard branches break. Just silence again. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening to every creak and chirp outside. In the morning, I checked around the tent. I didn't see any animal tracks, but I did notice a few scuffed areas in the dirt. Not prints exactly, just places where the pine needles had been pushed aside. Could have been wind, could have been anything, but something about it didn't sit right. Still, I stayed. I had no reason to leave. Not yet. Later that day, I decided to walk further down the old path I'd found the day before. I packed a small bag with water, jerky, and my knife, then marked the tent area on my GPS in case I lost track of the trail. After maybe an hour of walking, I came across something I wasn't expecting. A small wooden structure, hidden in a dip between 2 hills. It wasn't a full cabin, more like a hunting shack or a place someone might use to store gear. The wood looked aged and weathered. The roof was half collapsed on one side, and there were thick patches of grass and brush growing around the base. I could tell no one had used it in a long time. Still, something about it gave me a chill. I didn't go inside, just looked from a distance, then turned back the way I came. When I got back to my tent, it was late afternoon. I boiled some water for another meal and tried to shake off the uneasiness. The forest felt different that night, like something had shifted slightly, and I couldn't quite say why. I fell asleep around 10, but woke up just after 1 in the morning. This time I was sure there were footsteps outside the tent. Not a bear, not some wandering deer. These were slow, careful steps. Human. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. I laid there, still in the sleeping bag, hearing the soft crunches of dirt and needles just outside the thin nylon walls. The steps circled, once, twice, then stopped right near the door. I grabbed the flashlight and the handgun, still zipped inside the bag. I held both, heart hammering, waiting for something to happen. A sound, a movement, a zipper pull, anything, but nothing came. After maybe 10 minutes, the steps slowly moved away. I listened until the last crunch was gone, and even then, I stayed still for another hour, wide-eyed and sweating in the dark. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The clearing was just as I'd left it, but near the base of a tree 10 feet from the tent, I saw a small pile of stones. 4 of them, stacked one on top of the other. They weren't there the day before. I was sure of that. That was when I made the decision to leave. I packed up fast, rolling the tent and stuffing my gear into the truck. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just loaded everything, jumped into the front seat, and started driving. But here's the part that stayed with me, even more than the steps outside or the stones by the tree. As I drove down the forest road, winding back the way I came, I passed a turnoff I hadn't noticed before. A newer looking path with tire marks fresher than anything else I'd seen up there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stopped the truck, backing up a few feet to get a better look. I shouldn't have. About 30 feet down that trail was another vehicle, an old Dodge Ram pickup, dark green, with mud-caked tires and a cracked rear window. In the bed of the truck, I saw something wrapped in a blue tarp, large, heavy-looking, tied down with ropes. I didn't stay long, just long enough to recognize that tarp wasn't holding wood or gear. I shifted into drive and didn't stop again until I was back on the main road. I didn't report it. I should have, I know that now, but I didn't want to get pulled into something I didn't understand. I just wanted to be gone. It's been years since that trip. I haven't been back to that part of New Mexico. Haven't done another solo trip that deep in the woods. I still go camping sometimes with friends in places that feel safe. Open campgrounds, trails with maps and signs. But even now, on clear nights when everything is quiet, I still remember the slow steps outside my tent, the way someone or something stood just inches from me in the dark, how nothing ever made a sound when it left. And I think about that old shack, and that truck, and the blue tarp. That's what stays in my head the longest. The tarp, tight, quiet, still. I still wonder if someone else went out there after me. Someone who didn't hear the steps in time. Someone who never came back. I was 34 when I decided to take that trip. It was the summer of 2018, mid-June, and I had just gone through a messy breakup with someone I'd been with for 4 years. I wasn't looking to escape my life. I just needed to be somewhere that didn't remind me of anything. No traffic lights.
No apartment walls.
No phone service. I needed to disappear for a few days. Not forever, just long enough to clear my head. I packed light but smart. I had a 2-man tent I'd only used once, a sleeping bag I trusted, my old hiking boots, and my aluminum stove. I filled my backpack with dry food, a simple cook pot, a water filter, extra socks, a headlamp, my small first aid kit, and a knife I'd bought in my 20s and kept sharp. I left my phone on airplane mode and tossed it into the side pocket, just for emergencies. I picked a place I'd never been, Blackburn Woods, about 3 hours north of Newcastle. I'd found it on a hiking forum. One guy had written a post about an underrated, rugged, low-traffic area with dense pine, good views, and plenty of clearings for tents. It wasn't official parkland, just wild forest surrounded by private farmland and long-forgotten trails. That appealed to me. I arrived around noon. The parking area was a dirt patch just off a narrow country road, with no signage. I slung my bag over my shoulder, locked the car, and stepped into the trees. The trail wasn't marked, but the guy from the forum had uploaded GPS coordinates. I had printed a map. The first hour was easy walking. Muddy in places, thick underbrush, but mostly quiet and shaded. Birds chirped overhead. Branches creaked in the breeze. Felt like the right decision. By early evening, I had made it to a flat spot near a bend in a stream. I didn't want to camp too close to the water, so I found a dry patch maybe 30 meters uphill, just off the trail. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and boiled water for rice and lentils. It started to drizzle around 7, but the trees kept most of it off. I ate under the tarp and read a paperback until the sky darkened. That first night was uneventful. I slept hard, woke up cold around 4, pulled the bag tighter around me, and drifted off again. It was the second day when I noticed something strange. I had gone for a long walk up the ridge behind my site, looking for views or open spots to sit and think. I was gone for maybe 3 hours. When I returned, I noticed the corner of my tent looked slightly off. One of the stakes had been pulled out. I chalked it up to the wind or maybe the slope of the ground. Still, it made me feel uneasy. Nothing else was disturbed. My food was untouched. My bag was still zipped. I walked a slow circle around my tent, checking the trees, the brush, the ground. I saw no footprints, but the pine needles were thick and spongy. Someone could have walked right through without leaving a clear trace. I pushed the thought aside and focused on collecting firewood for the night. The drizzle had stopped, but the clouds hung low and heavy. Everything smelled wet. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Snapping branches, a slow shuffling sound, like something heavy being dragged through brush. I told myself it was just animals, deer maybe, or a badger. I unzipped the tent once and shined my light through the mesh. Nothing. I zipped it back up and laid there for what felt like hours, trying not to move. I finally drifted off sometime before dawn, and when I woke up, it was silent. Still, I forced myself to believe it was all in my head, that I was just spooked because I was alone. But on the third morning, I found boot prints near the stream. They weren't mine. I checked. My boots left a broad, flat print with a crack on the left heel where the rubber had worn through. These were different, narrower, newer, deeper. I followed them for a few meters before they vanished into the brush. No trail, no direction, just gone. That was when I decided to move camp. I packed up in a rush and hiked further into the woods. I followed the stream for over 2 hours until the landscape changed, rockier, with fewer trees and more open space. I found a small clearing just past a narrow ridge. It was exposed, but at that point I felt safer being able to see everything around me. I made camp again. This time I didn't light a fire. That evening, I kept my headlamp off. I sat in the dark with my back to a boulder, listening. I kept my knife in my lap. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my ears. Around midnight, I heard it again. A snap, then another. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath. The sound stopped. I waited 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Then a loud crack, maybe 10 meters from where I sat. I turned my head, but I couldn't see a thing.
No mon.
Just black shapes of trees against black sky. Then I heard a sound I will never forget. A deep, guttural cough. Human, low, harsh, like someone trying to clear dust from their throat. I stayed absolutely still. No other sounds followed. I stayed frozen until the first hint of light broke through the trees. When I stepped out of the shadows, I found no prints, no broken branches, but I knew what I heard. I left everything behind. I walked fast, heading straight south by the compass, crashing through brush, jumping rocks, tearing through ferns. I didn't care about the trail. I just wanted out. By late afternoon, I found a logging road. I followed it until I reached a metal gate. Beyond that was pastureland and a dirt road. I walked until I reached a village. A man at a petrol station let me use his landline to call a taxi. I never filed a report. I didn't have a name or a face. I never told anyone either. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to remember it more than I already did. For weeks afterward, I kept replaying that cough in my head. Not just the sound, but the meaning behind it. It wasn't a cough like someone was sick. It wasn't a natural clearing of the throat. It was deliberate, loud enough to hear, sharp enough to send a message. It said, "I see you." I was 34 when it happened, during the summer of 2017. I'd been through a rough patch in London. Work had piled up, my girlfriend and I had broken things off in spring, and I was feeling like my head was filled with static. I needed air, not city air, but real, clean, silent air. Something still and far away. That's how I ended up heading out to Derbyshire with a borrowed tent and a backpack that felt heavier with every step. I'd planned a 4-day solo hike along a quiet trail that looped through a mix of moorland and old forest just east of Buxton. I had no schedule. I liked it that way. I carried my own food, my own gear, and I picked places to camp based on what looked quiet and dry. It was around the 3rd day when I first noticed something wasn't right. It had rained lightly during the night, not heavy, just that constant English drizzle that seeps into everything. I'd set up camp a short distance off a gravel path near a small clearing surrounded by tall, damp ash trees. Everything felt calm that morning. I made instant coffee on a tiny camp stove, packed my sleeping bag, checked for ticks, and was on the move by 10. But after about an hour, I started noticing signs I wasn't alone. Nothing loud or dramatic, just little things that made my skin tighten. First, I found boot prints in the mud. Big ones, bigger than mine, and deep. Someone heavy, maybe wearing old-style work boots. They were pointed in the same direction I was walking. That wasn't strange by itself. It was public access land after all. But the area was known to be unpopular, especially midweek. I hadn't seen a single soul since the first day. Then I found a crushed can of lager in the underbrush. Tenants, bent and dirt smeared. It looked old, but not ancient. I left it, but the idea stuck in my head like a thorn. The next 2 hours were quiet. I passed by a dried-up stone wall, the remains of some old property line from decades ago. There was something calming about it. I rested there, ate some almonds and drank water. That's when I thought I saw someone. Just a glimpse movement between the trees ahead. A flash of dark, not animal fast, more like the careful shift of someone watching without wanting to be seen. I froze, watched, waited. Nothing moved again. I told myself it was the wind, but I still stayed still a while longer than I normally would have. I scanned the trees carefully before moving on. By evening, the clouds had built up again, and I knew I needed to set up camp. I picked a spot deeper into the woods this time, just far enough from the trail that no casual walker would stumble into me. The ground was soft with moss, and the canopy above was thick enough to keep out most of the rain. I set up my tent quickly and gathered what dry sticks I could for a small fire, just enough to boil water and feel a bit of comfort. That night I couldn't relax. Every noise around me felt like something creeping closer. I tried reading on my Kindle, but my eyes kept darting up toward the trees, watching for shapes that weren't there. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. Not a deer or a fox, not some squirrel digging in the leaves. These were slow, heavy, one step at a time. Crunch, pause, crunch. It was just outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I lay there for what felt like a full hour, waiting, heart thudding in my throat. Then I heard nothing, just the wind and a bit of drizzle starting up again. Eventually, I fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I opened the tent slowly, cautiously. The air was wet and cold. I stepped out and looked around.
No footprints.
But a small pile of stones had been left right by the edge of the clearing, stacked like a cairn. 5 or 6 flat rocks, balanced carefully, not something that happens by accident. I stared at it for a long time. Then I kicked it over, packed my things, and left. I spent most of that day pushing hard, trying to cover more distance than I'd planned. I figured I'd wrap up the trip a day early. I kept checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The silence of the woods started to feel unnatural.
No birdsong, no squirrels.
Just wind and distant branches creaking. By the time I made it to the lower part of the trail near the reservoir, it was late afternoon. The landscape opened up a bit there. No more thick woods, just wide moorland with tall brown grass and distant fences. I felt safer with the open sky, but the weather turned again.
Then,
Cold, heavy rain, no shelter for miles. I had no choice but to camp again. I found a dryish patch near a rock outcrop and set up my tent as fast as I could with numb fingers. I skipped the fire, too wet, ate a cold protein bar, and sat huddled in my sleeping bag as the rain beat down. That night is when it happened. I don't know what time it was. Sometime after dark, late, probably past 1 in the morning. I'd been dozing off when I heard it. A zipper, not mine. It was the unmistakable sound of a tent zipper being pulled. Not slowly, quick, sharp, but it wasn't my tent. It was somewhere nearby, close enough that I could hear it clearly over the sound of the rain.
he sat upright instantly.
My hands gripped the inside of my sleeping bag. My breath caught in my throat. Then I heard footsteps, wet, squelching footsteps on the grass, moving around, not rushing, not wandering, just pacing. I sat frozen for 10, maybe 15 minutes. Then I heard it again, the zipper sound, but this time nothing followed it, just the wind. When morning came, I packed faster than I ever had in my life. I barely ate. I didn't even change clothes. I just wanted out. I followed the trail south, where I knew there was a car park a couple of miles down. I was shaking the whole way. The air was thick, and everything smelled like wet leaves and muck. Then, about 30 minutes from the end, I found something that made my blood go cold. There was a tent, not hidden, just sitting there, sagging and half collapsed, at the edge of the trail behind a stone wall. Old style, dark green canvas. It looked damp, like it had been up for a while. But what made my skin crawl was what was inside. Nothing.
No gear,
No food.
no bag.
Just an old sleeping mat and some beer cans. But the cans weren't rusted or ancient. And there were fresh boot prints in the mud nearby, the same large ones I'd seen days before. And next to the tent, tucked into the tall grass, was a knife. Not a pocket knife. Kitchen knife. Large. Serrated. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked fast. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention. But every muscle in my body was screaming at me to get out. I reached the car park by midday. There was no one around. Just empty gravel and a single wooden signboard with a faded trail map. I got in my car and drove straight back to London. For days after, I kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't sleep properly. I'd wake up thinking I heard footsteps outside my window. I reported what I saw to the local police, more out of duty than hope. They took my statement but didn't seem too concerned. They told me people camp rough out there all the time, sometimes even squat for weeks. But the way that man moved, the sound of his steps, the way he lingered without ever showing himself, that wasn't someone just out for a quiet night in the woods. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe just to scare. Or maybe it was worse. All I know is I never went camping alone again. And I never will.